The 14th century was one of the darkest periods in European history, marked by extreme social unrest, religious fanaticism, and the catastrophic impact of the scapegoats or Black Death. This period of history was rife with fear, ignorance, and prejudice, particularly in response to the rapid spread of disease. Among the many victims of these widespread social anxieties were lepers, who were unfairly scapegoated and subjected to violent persecution, culminating in the leper massacres that swept across parts of Europe. Long before the Black Death, leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease, was already a feared and misunderstood illness in Europe. It was widely believed to be a punishment from God for immoral behavior, and those afflicted with the disease were often shunned from society. By the 12th century, lepers were isolated in leper colonies, or lazarettos, outlying institutions where they were kept separate from the healthy population. Leprosy, unlike the plague, is a slow-developing disease that causes severe disfigurement and nerve damage. While not as contagious as was once believed, the grotesque symptoms made it terrifying to the medieval population. Lepers were forced to wear distinctive clothing, often marked with a bell or a clapper, to announce their presence and warn others to keep their distance. Although many lepers lived out their lives in relative isolation, their existence was about to become even more perilous with the arrival of the Black Death. In 1347, Black Death arrived in Europe, decimating populations and spreading terror. Within just a few years, the plague had wiped out as much as 60% of Europe's population. The speed at which the disease spread left the medical knowledge of the time completely helpless, and as fear gripped the continent, people searched for someone to blame. Various groups were scapegoated for the devastation caused by the plague, including Jews, witches, and foreigners. Lepers, however, were among the most obvious targets. Already ostracized from society due to their disfigured appearance and assumed moral depravity, lepers became convenient culprits for the spread of the plague. Medieval populations, desperate to understand the disease, began to believe that lepers were actively poisoning wells, rivers, and water sources to spread the plague to healthy people. The myth of poisoned wells became a powerful tool in justifying the persecution of lepers. Rumors spread that lepers, in collusion with Jews and other outsiders, were conspiring to deliberately infect the population by contaminating drinking water. This accusation took hold in many communities, with local authorities and religious leaders feeding into the panic by supporting these baseless claims. In 1321, over a decade before the Black Death ravaged Europe, a severe persecution of lepers broke out inside France. Although leprosy was not connected to the plague at this point, lepers were accused of poisoning wells in an alleged conspiracy with Jews and Muslims. King Philip V of France ordered an investigation, and many lepers were arrested and tortured. The confessions extracted under torture were used to justify mass executions, as many lepers were burned at the stake or buried alive. This tragic precedent of targeting lepers for poisoning wells would be repeated with even more brutality during the time of the Black Death. As the plague ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, fear turned into violence, and lepers were frequently targeted in mass pogroms across France, Germany, and Switzerland. Entire leper colonies were attacked by mobs, their inhabitants brutally murdered or burned alive in their homes. In Toulouse, France, for instance, lepers were accused of poisoning wells, leading to a wave of executions. In Switzerland, local councils enacted brutal purges of lepers, claiming that their supposed conspiracy to spread the plague justified extermination. The hysteria became so widespread that even those merely suspected of leprosy could be lynched by angry mobs, often without any official trial or process. One particularly chilling example took place in the town of Chillon, where a group of lepers was rounded up, tortured for confessions, and burned alive in mass executions. The scale of the violence against lepers escalated to the point where the massacres almost became an institutionalized practice in some regions, with the full support of local authorities. The Church, which held significant power over medieval society, played a complex role in the persecution of lepers. On one hand, Christian teachings called for charity and mercy towards the sick, including lepers. Lazar houses and leper hospitals had been established across Europe as acts of Christian charity. However, the Church was also complicit in fanning the flames of fear. Preachers often spoke of the plague as divine punishment for the sins of humanity, and lepers were frequently portrayed as living embodiments of sin. In some cases, clerics directly endorsed the massacres, arguing that the extermination of lepers was a necessary purification of society. The fear of divine retribution for harboring plague spreaders contributed to the mob violence that erupted across Europe. By the late 14th century, the mass persecution of lepers had largely subsided, but the scars remained. The Black Death had fundamentally reshaped European society, intensifying class divisions, religious fanaticism, and xenophobia. Lepers, already marginalized before the plague, became one of the many victims of a society in chaos, devastated by disease and seeking scapegoats for its suffering. The leper massacres of the 14th century stand as a tragic reminder of how fear and ignorance can lead to horrific violence against the most vulnerable members of society. The false accusations, tortures, and brutal executions inflicted on Europe's lepers reveal the dark side of medieval attitudes toward disease and those deemed other. In hindsight, the persecution of lepers serves as an early example of the dangers of misinformation and the human capacity to dehumanize and destroy those who are different, especially in times of social upheaval and crisis. While leprosy was far less contagious than believed, its victims became unwilling symbols of humanity's desperate search for control over the uncontrollable horrors of the Black Death.